Amy can financially plan for the future and focus on excelling in her classes. Dr. Smith, I'd appreciate your insight. What role do income share agreements play in the broader conversation of college affordability?
Certainly, particularly for students who have maxed out their federal student loans and are relying on financial products in the private market, private student loans. Income share agreements could be a good alternative to those private student loans. They have an inherent risk sharing in the way that Purdue has done them, and I think that's probably the best possible mechanism for the school itself to have some skin in the game and not just some kind of investor somewhere else, that the school itself is relying on the students to pay back. But first, the students should be maxing out their federal student loans so that they are using those kinds of products to offset credit card debt and other things like that.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you think they should play a role in the overall.
I think they could play a role. I think it would be, I think they could play a role for many students that have that need.
Well, I have legislation that would establish a framework so that these contracts will be legally recognized,
yes,
and instill consumer protections,
yes,
for income share.
We need a framework for income share agreements because right now, as you know, there's not one that exists.
Yeah. Thank you, Doctor.
I want to talk about the burden of student loan debt, something students and families across the country consistently say they want Congress to address this. Right now, we have millions and millions of workers who scramble every month just to pay back their loans. We have millions and millions of families who are unable to take important life steps like buying a home because they have student debt. And we have millions and millions of students who are being deterred from actually pursuing higher education because they worry about having to shoulder that debt. So my question is kind of simple. How important is it that the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act take steps to help reduce their student debt?
Extraordinarily expensive. Not all debt is bad, but we have a clear problem with some students, particularly low-income students and students of color who disproportionately rely on debt. Recent reports have come out that a quarter of black bachelor's degree graduates are defaulting on their student loans. So we've clearly got to do something to address affordability on the front end for students, but also to make sure that there are really great repayment options on the back end. That default is the worst possible outcome, so that kind of masks the many more students who are struggling. As you mentioned, they may be making the payments, but who knows what other sacrifices they're making in life. Right. That message that it sends to would-be students that, it can be really, really tough and life-altering to go to college reduces their likelihood and their desire to take on debt. And I think we're seeing that backlash now. So we really must have in the next reauthorization something to make sure that debt is affordable, truly affordable. And I know that's something that you all discussed in previous hearings, and that the students don't have to take on so much debt in the first place. And we know that that debt is not, when we talk about averages, that masks some kind of clear and present issues within that debt bubble.
Right. In your testimony, you spoke to the need to strengthen Pell Grants to make college more affordable, in particular for working families. But not everyone has access to that important source of aid, and some students face challenges in keeping their grants. So I wanted to ask you, in addition to increasing the maximum Pell Award, what are some of the policy changes that you would recommend for federal grants to help more students afford college and stay on track?
So as it relates to Pell Grants in particular?
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that has been talked about in many years past, and I don't know if it's possible now, but we have a Pell Grant program that effectively acts as an entitlement, but we don't fund it that way. We fund it as if it's a discretionary program year after year, and it would be really great to kind of see if we could bring that conversation about mandatory Pell back. Another thing is just the cost of living increases. Many other federal programs have those. Instinctively, year after year, we recognize that there's going to be inflation, and we have a cost of living increase added to them. Pell doesn't have that. So inflationary increases in Pell Grant are also very, very important. And then there's the prospect of even expanding Pell to families that don't, to students that don't get it now. The drug question as part of Pell Grants is we do a lot of work at Lumina with incarcerated populations. And even if they actually don't meet the definition of not being eligible for federal student aid, the fact that the question is there really deters many students.
Deters them from even applying. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We've spoken about the federalization and Dr. Robinson's testimony, the federalization of how we pay for colleges. The more student loan dollars, the less colleges are putting out, states are putting out towards colleges. Dr. Smith nodding her head. Now, and people have spoken of a maintenance of effort. How do we get the states to continue to put up the jack that they previously have so that it's not falling upon students and upon federal aid programs? But what is different is that if we have a maintenance of effort for primary and secondary school, that is institution or state-based loans or grants or money, whereas for colleges it's student-based. So the issue is, if the money is going to the student, how do you get maintenance of effort from the state? Because really the state is the bystander as the student pulls down the money. I hope that question's not too convoluted, but y'all, I think, know what I'm speaking of. Dr. Smith, your comments?
So you would have to really create a new program. There's not really currently. There was a maintenance of effort kind of in the last reauthorization that was going to a very small pot of funding. But in order to really leverage state spending, you would have to create a really new paradigm. It doesn't exist. I think.
What is that paradigm? Do you know what that paradigm is?
You would have to have someone from the state, it could be a state higher education executive officer, could be a governor, agree, someone with the authority to actually, make some guarantees. And actually, the maintenance of effort that was included in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and ARA.
Yes, but that was direct funding that you only got if you maintain.
Yes.
Now, are you suggesting that that's what we need to do if we're going to have to leverage?
Yes, we're going to have to create something new that does not currently exist.
So does that take dollars away that are currently being loaned to students and instead giving it to the...
I would say that I think you really need to have a substantial amount of new funding to be available for this. And right now, we're just not leveraging any of the federal money at all in this way, as you know.
We're totally not leveraging.
Expertly outlined the challenge, and I know we're over time, so we could talk more about specific ways that you could do that.
Thank you. I yield back.
You notice how disciplined Vanderbilt graduates are in staying within the time we got. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So at this point, anyone who denies we have a college affordability and debt crisis problem in this country has their head buried pretty deep in the sand. We know the basic facts, and we've talked a lot about them in multiple hearings here, but I want to zoom in on one particularly alarming statistic. The Education Department recently released data showing that almost half of all black students who took out loans in 2003, 2004 have defaulted on their federal student loans. Black college students default at 5 times the rate of white college graduates. In fact, black college graduates are more likely to default than white college dropouts. Most people are better off because they go to college, but this wasn't true for nearly half of all black students. So what I want to think about is how we solve that problem. There are a lot of pieces to understand the data, but how do we fix the problem? So Dr. Smith, let me ask you, do you think that more financial aid counseling alone will fix this problem?
No.
What about FAFSA simplification? Will that fix the problem?
Very good, but won't fix it.
Okay. How about risk sharing or accreditation reform?
Also, really, really great things won't fix this particular problem.
How about college deregulation?
Well, no.
No, not going to fix this problem. Okay, and recently, the chair of the House Education Committee argued, quote, there isn't any more money out there to spend on students in higher education. Can we solve this problem without investing more money in our college students?
I think it's really difficult, and especially when Congress passes billions of dollars of tax cuts and things like that, which I know is not the purview of this committee. But when I talk to people every single day, they don't understand the rhetoric that there's not there for money to better themselves through education, but there is for these other types of things.
You know, Dr. Smith, actually, I think you put it exactly the right way. That we just learned that congressional Republicans could find $1.5 trillion to give away to rich people and corporations, but suddenly there is no money left to invest in people who are trying to get a college education. An investment that not only pays off for the individual, but pays off for the whole economy and for the whole country. You know, the higher education law that we write in this committee could be the law of the land for the next decade. And it would be unconscionable for us to write a law without making college more affordable and without dealing with the 40 million Americans who are struggling to pay off $1.4 trillion in student loan debt. I think that should be our first job. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Last year, the University of New Hampshire launched a program called Granite Guarantee. Under this program, first-year Pell Grant-eligible New Hampshire students will receive free tuition for 4 years. Over 400 students have been served under the Granite Guarantee program, and the tuition assistance program is expanding to our entire university system. In an effort to make college more affordable and expand access to low-income students, institutions and state university systems are implementing these kinds of programs across the country. So we also know that we need to be thinking about how to help students beyond tuition, because the entire panel has made this point. It's not just tuition, it's the cost of living. So as we look at ways to leverage federal aid to expand access to college, how do you think states and institutions of higher education should be using an affordability goal to inform their policies and funding?
First, I think that's fantastic. I think more states need to have an affordability goal. Right now, we talk about affordability, but we don't tell people what that means. So the average person doesn't know when you say, I want to make college more affordable without something specific that resonates with them. They don't understand what you're trying to accomplish and how they, what that requires of them. So I think having that goal is important. And then secondly, having goals complementary around completion. So you can't just get people in, you also have to make sure that you're helping them through. And you could, I want to make sure we say this, could actually have affordability just for people who are already going, and that would be terrible for us to just say, oh, we're not going to use this to get more people in, we're going to just use this to make it less expensive for those that are already going. So those things have to pair together.
I get it that when thinking about the way that the government spends money, department to department, it's apples to oranges. But when we buy a submarine from Electric Boat in Connecticut, we, at the outset, set expectations for the quality of that submarine, right? And say, if you can't meet these qualifications, then we're not going to buy it from you. But then after that, we look to cost. And we essentially try to buy the cheapest product for the specs that we set out. And I understand we're not going to revolutionize the way that we spend federal student aid dollars, but why don't we look at higher education in somewhat of the same way, in that we set an expectation that every degree has a quality metric attached to it, that we're not going to fund schools in which 40% of their students can't pay back their loans, but that we're also going to have an affordability expectation, that we're not going to pay more than X for a degree. And if you can't produce these results for a certain amount of money, then you're no longer in the game. Give us a little bit more on what we should build into an accountability system when it comes to affordability.
So I actually think what you just described would revolutionize the way we spend federal student aid, and we should do it. We're at a breaking point. I think the statistics that we've referenced, the fact that so many African-American students are struggling, and not just African-American students, but so many students are struggling to pay, and they're struggling with loans. And we've reached a point where there's a crisis in college affordability. And so that crisis requires some kind of revolutionizing the system. And the amount of money that is currently spent on federal student aid without any kinds of clear guarantees, and we have a baseline, cohort default rates, and you all talked about that before, how that's insufficient, et cetera. But along with those quality criteria, some guarantees around affordability, which could include about how many people repay their loans or how easy it is, recognizing the limits of that, there need to be also some front-end limitations, would revolutionize the system and is absolutely necessary.
Does anyone have any comment on Dr. Robinson's point about using the median cost of college rather than getting more money to go to Duke than North Carolina or Vanderbilt in Tennessee?
I agree that giving students more aid because they go to more expensive institutions, more federal aid, is problematic. That said, that the current loan limits, particularly for dependent students, as most of the students attending schools like Duke are not high enough for this issue to solve many of these problems for many students. There are just not very many people whose amount of loan is affected by anything that Duke might do to change its price. But it is certainly true that saying if that's what we do for graduate students, however, for graduate students, we give them as much money as cost of attendance. We should not do that.
I would concur with most of what Dr. Baum just said. And Vanderbilt and colleges, I won't just talk about Vanderbilt, not about Duke, but they actually offer very generous financial aid. So no student at Vanderbilt has to take out a loan to attend college at all because they offer financial aid, and donors are able to pay for that without, and that comes out of Vanderbilt's endowment actually. So I think there needs to be some discrimination in terms of whether college, and not every college does that. More colleges that have the resources, like Vanderbilt, should be encouraged to do that. It'd be shame on them if they have the resources and they're not doing what Vanderbilt does. But the specific challenge that she raised, I think that's the wrinkle, is that one, the current loan limits don't actually bump up against what even the tuition and fees are. And I would venture to guess UNC is very inexpensive, but with the full cost of attendance, you can't meet it just with federal student aid, which is part of the challenge that we're faced with today. So in theory, I think it makes sense, but in practice, I think where we are with college prices has unfortunately already outstripped what the federal aid is that's available.